Down from heaven comes the blessing and the help to take you home. Down Geronimo, Geronimo. If the silken victim cannot be, take a look around. The air is full of beautiful things from battle on the ground. Till we join the kiss the bank until the lake begins to come. Down Geronimo, Geronimo. It's the glory of the glory, but you're ready, here we go. Down Geronimo, Geronimo.
Hello, friends. Thank you for joining me today for this episode of Down from Heaven, the 11th Airborne Division in World War II and beyond. I'm your host, Jeremy Holm. I am a former American bobsled athlete who has turned 11th Airborne Division historian to honor my grandfather, First Lieutenant Andrew Carrico, and all of his buddies who defended freedom in World War II. Now, I am the author of 3 books on the Angels, and it's an honor to travel across the United States lecturing on the history of the 11th Airborne from 1943 through today. And speaking of lecturing, I recently had the opportunity to do a live Q&A with my new friends in Morioka, Japan. This lecture was held to help open a wonderful museum exhibit that focuses on the Allied occupation of Japan, and I was able to shed light on the 11th Airborne's time in occupation duty from 1945 to 1949, and also explain how our Angels helped Morioka and the Amori and Iwate prefectures rebuild after the war. So we discussed how two nations who were previously enemies came together to create a partnership that still exists to this day. So to all my friends in Japan, Tomodachi ni narete ureshi desu. Hope I said that right, but I think you got the gist of it. At the same time I was sharing the 11th Airborne's early history in Japan on this particular video conference, a group of our modern Arctic Angels were in country holding training exercises with the Japan Ground Self-Defense Force and other multinational partners. Now, these exercises reinforced interoperability, trust, and shared commitment to peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific. And the historian in me was excited to hear that these Angels visited what the 11th Airborne Division called Camp Crawford in Hokkaido, which is now an operational JG SDF site. Now, the Angels originally built Camp Crawford in 1946, and they stayed there until heading back to the States in 1949. So this site represents the decades-long ties between the United States and Japan. But if you'd like to listen to the audio recording of my lecture on the 11th Airborne Division's time in Japan with Morioka, that episode will be coming soon, so stay tuned. And as you know, all of our episodes are available on the streaming service of your choice. We have all the options on the table of Spotify, Apple Podcast, iHeartRadio, Amazon Music, and so forth. And I hope you'll give that episode a listen. You know, it was a wonderful experience chatting with the people of Morioka, and I'm grateful to now be known in Morioka as Jeremy-san. So I guess I can officially say that I'm big in Japan. Now, the topic of today's video is a piece of the 11th Airborne Division's history in World War II that does not get a lot of attention. So, you know me, I wanted to tell the full story. Almost everyone knows that the 11th Airborne Division fought in the Battle for Manila and helped liberate Luzon from Imperial Japan in 1945. But here's the question. How did they get to Manila? Where did that part of the story begin? Well, let's jump in and find out. After the 11th Airborne Division's bloody campaign to liberate Leyte in 1944, the surviving Angels came down from the mountains to rest and re-equip on the beaches near Bito through January of 45. Now, these Angels were exhausted. G511's David Webb said, "Battles across Leyte produced a truly pitiful-looking bunch of paratroopers, an ordeal we all wanted to forget. Exhausted, sick, and wounded, we had done ourselves proud, but were too tired to realize it. Or, too tired to give a damn might be more fitting." Now, as their bodies healed, these Angels spent time on the beaches and swimming in the ocean. Some took to exploring the surrounding areas and visiting nearby units, including 2 paratroopers who did what most privates would never dream of doing. They called on a 5-star general. That's right. 2 Angels basically knocked on General Douglas MacArthur's door and asked to come in. Here's the story. The 511th PIR's PFC Ralph Marasicki and Private Charles Fewerson had been tasked with delivering a captured enemy map of California with invasion sites marked on it to Division Commander General Joseph Swing's headquarters. Now, this map had been found during the Leyte Campaign on a dead Japanese officer in the officer's satchel. So, after visiting Swing's CP, these two angels were tasked with carrying the map up to Tacloban, to General MacArthur's headquarters. And so off they went, and upon arrival, Private Frierson turned to his buddy and said, "Ralph, we are never going to get another chance to be this close to General MacArthur. Why don't we visit him?" Right? I mean, a paratrooper's confidence. Well, a duty sergeant outside General MacArthur's office did not quite see it that way, so he turned the angels away. But being angels, they persisted, and they found Lieutenant Colonel Roger Egberg, who was General MacArthur's physician. So the two angels talked to the good doctor, explained the situation, and the colonel said to come back in an hour. So Charles and Ralph did so, and General MacArthur greeted them and welcomed them into his office, saying that he had visited both of their hometowns, so Cleveland and the Bronx. And, MacArthur and these two angels spent about 10 minutes talking about the 11th Airborne's campaign on Leyte. And, they were looking at operational maps, and these two paratroopers later said they were surprised with just how aware General MacArthur was of what the angels were doing in the mountains. And so they boldly asked the general, they said, "Why are the newspapers back home not reporting on what we're doing?" So General MacArthur explained that he was leaving the 11th Airborne Division out of his headquarters official communiques. He wanted the Angels to be kind of a secret weapon for them. And so that answer satisfied the two paratroopers, but the division commander, General Joseph May Swing, when he heard about this interaction between his angels and General MacArthur and General MacArthur's response, General Swing kind of laughed and he said he had Blarney all right, which, as you know, means skillful flattery. But before leaving General MacArthur's office, the two angels asked him another question, one that all their buddies had been wondering about during the Leyte campaign, and they asked, why is the 11th Airborne Division being used as ground infantry instead of for some special aerial insertion operation or mission? So General MacArthur told them, he said that there was plans in the works, that they would be able to use their training in the near future. Well, MacArthur's plans, at least what he was hinting at, is the topic of today's episode, the Angels' invasion of southern Luzon. And today's episode is kind of more of a part one. Part two will cover the Angels' jumps on Tagaytay Ridge and the battle for the Aga Pass. Now, before Charles and Ralph headed back to the division, they walked out with General MacArthur out of his office and into kind of the waiting area, which, to paint the picture, it was full of all these generals and high-ranking officers that were waiting to see the general. And they were kind of annoyed that these two lowly privates had taken so much time that they had to wait to meet with General MacArthur. So General MacArthur he shook their hands and he said, "Tell your boys that I'm real proud of the 11th Airborne." And when that got spread around the division, another angel declared, "Praise from Caesar." So something was in the works for the Angels, and the next indicator came on January 2nd when General Swing had lunch with General Robert Eichelberger, who was now commander of the U.S. 8th Army, and they were discussing what role the 11th Airborne Division would play in the upcoming invasion of Luzon. General Eichelberger later wrote in his journal, he said, "I like Joe's outfit. They look like they'll fight plenty." And they would. Now, Eichelberger had been tasked by General MacArthur with landing on southern Luzon to contain the enemy forces south of Manila, and the general wanted the Angels for this fight in particular. So 8 days later, on January 10th, General Eichelberger and General Swing met again to discuss the initial plans that had come down from MacArthur's HQ. And neither General Eichelberger nor General Swing were fans of what they read. And here's why. So a week later, on January 17th, General Swing and his assistant division commander, Brigadier General Albert Pearson, who everybody called Big Al, they went to a briefing at General Eichelberger's headquarters. And in attendance was the Navy's Admiral Frank Fletcher and 5th Air Force Chief of Staff Major General Donald Hutchinson. Okay, so a lot of brass in the room. So plans were discussed for 8th Army's invasion of southern Luzon, and while General Swing was happy to hear that yes, his Angels were going to participate, he hated the plans that he was hearing. So we have to remember, U.S. 6th Army had landed up north of Manila at Ligayan Gulf, and were pushing south towards Manila. So back in early December of 44, there had actually been talk of attaching the Angels to General Walter Kruger's 6th Army for that invasion up north. But that idea was ultimately rejected because at the time, Allied air units really were unable to handle a divisional airborne mission. So in the end, the Angels were assigned to General Eichelberger's 8th Army, and that's the good part. The bad part was that to prevent the enemy's forces in southern Luzon from moving north into Manila and up to engage 6th Army, the plan was for the 11th Airborne to drop reinforced companies from the 511th Parachute Infantry kind of piecemeal across southern Luzon. So these 200-man units would, for the most part, have very limited support, although Filipino guerrilla groups would assist in some of those areas. So General Swing is hearing all this, and he's looking at the maps, and he's looking at the intelligence. He is looking at the enemy strength, the estimated enemy strength in these areas. And he immediately knew that his men were going to suffer high and unnecessary casualties. So Captain John Conable, who served in the division's 457th Parachute Field Artillery and then was later quartermaster, he said General Swing was livid at the suggestion that we be scattered all over. Swing was always first in line to defend his men, so he told the powers to be, quote, "If you want to take my division from me, relieve me of command, but give my men a fighting chance." The general later wrote to his father-in-law, General Peyton March. Yeah, that General Peyton March. He explained what his feelings, and he said, "In my estimation, the Battle of Luzon is going to take everything we've got out here and maybe a little bit more." So rightfully, General Swing pushed for a concentration of his forces and not a wide dispersal. He later said of these initial plans that they would have frittered away the division, the strongest single weapon GHQ had in reserve once the 6th Army had been committed. Moreover, such dissipation would have failed not only to contain the 30,000 odd Japanese in southern Luzon, but it would have permitted them to rush to the reinforcement of the Shimbu line east of Manila, which, as it was, proved a very mean obstacle to the 6th Army. Now, the concept of dropping the 11th Airborne Division piecemeal across southern Luzon, well, that came from General MacArthur's headquarters, in particularly the S3 section under Operations Chief Lieutenant General Stephen Chamberlain. And I want to point out that 8th Army's General Robert Eichelberger, he completely agreed with General Swing's assessment of these initial plans. He highly disagreed with what was going to happen. So, but thankfully, due to General Swing's very vocal opposition and with the support of General Robert Eichelberger, these initial and awful concepts of breaking up the 11th Airborne and dropping them across southern Luzon, those were dropped. So instead, on January 2nd, the Angels received the final plans for the operation, for their operation in Field Order Number 17, which said the 11th Airborne will land one regimental combat team on X Day at H hour in the Nasugbu area, seize and defend a beachhead. 511th Parachute Regimental Combat Team will be prepared to move by air from Leyte and Mindoro bases, land by parachute on Tagaytay Ridge, effect the junction with the force of the 11th Airborne Division moving inland from Nasugbu. The 11th Airborne Division, reinforced, after assembling on Tagaytay Ridge, will be prepared for further action to the north and east, as directed by Commanding General 8th Army. Now, you'll notice that that last part was a little bit vague, and that will be the subject of some future episodes. For now, General Eichelberger wanted the 11th Airborne Division to land in southern Luzon on the beaches of Nasugbu, and this was part of Operation Mike 6, and the date was set for January 31st, which really only gave the Angels about 6 days to finish their preparations. So General Swing decided that his amphibious landing force, the one that was going to hit the beaches at Nasugbu, um, this is in Luzon's Batangas province. So General Swing decided that the amphibious force was going to consist of the 187th and 188th Glider Infantries, supported by elements from the 127th Airborne Engineers and the 674th and 675th Glider Artilleries. Now, in these few days before the operation kicked off, numerous lectures were held in the division's war room, which included sand tables, aerial photographs, maps, and so forth. And a lot of these briefings were actually given by 11th Airborne troopers who had served on Luzon, including in southern Luzon, before the war began. So wonderful intel. Now, the division's 408th Quartermaster Company had one of the toughest jobs at the time, since about 90% of the division's supplies of personal equipment had been destroyed either by the Japanese during their surprise attack on the airfields at Barawan, and also just by Leyte's jungle environment, which destroyed equipment, shoes, you name it. So 408th was very busy in these few days, very hectic. Now, I do want to backtrack for just a second. Before these last minute rushes and preparations were going on, General Swing actually sent Silver Star recipient First Lieutenant Robert Dickerson, who selected Staff Sergeant Vernon Clark to go with him. But these two were sent on a recon mission to, recon the landing beaches and to obtain information and intelligence from the local Filipino guerrillas about the disposition of enemy forces in Nasugbu and then inland as well up to Tagaytay Ridge. And they also wanted to verify that the roads from the beaches to Tagaytay Ridge were passable for the division's transportations, the trucks and the jeeps and so forth. So these two angels arrived at Nasugbu via submarine, and then they jumped in, rubber rafts, came to shore, where they were met by local Filipino guerrillas. So again, Dickerson and Clark landed at Nasugbu to gather intelligence for the enemy defenses in that area, but also they wanted to see what was going on in Lucena. And the Filipino guerrillas that they met up with, well, they said that there were an estimated 2,000 Japanese at Nasugbu, with an additional 12,000 enemy nearby who were supported by artillery and tanks. So bad news for an understrength airborne division that was lightly supported. So even worse, there were potentially 7 to 15,000 Japanese around Tagaytay Ridge, where the 511th PIR's, RCT, was planned to land in just a few days' time. Now, the Angels were never ones to avoid a fight. Not then, not now. But those numbers were a little bit concerning, right? Considering the Angels are only going to have light artillery to support them and no armor. So the negative reports were substantiated by Captain John Richmond of the 503rd PIR. So Captain Richmond had been sent to the area to gather some intelligence, and this was prior to the 503rd's famous jump on Corregidor. So Captain Richmond made his way back to General MacArthur's headquarters with his own intel, and he said the situation was worse than they actually thought. When Dickerson, Clark, and Richmond all reported in, and they started tallying up the estimated numbers, they realized that the 11th Airborne, if they landed at Nasugbu, they could potentially find themselves outnumbered 6-1. So PFC George Doherty of the 511th's headquarters company of the 3rd Battalion, he said the odds for success were overwhelmingly against the 11th Airborne Division in light of the intelligence reports. So George then rightfully called the Angels' landings one of the most thrilling and courageous moves by an Army commander to make. The commitment of a small airborne division to the task that 3 divisions were planned to execute. So that's right, initially 3 divisions were going to participate in the landings at Nasugbu, but ultimately, because of some changes in operational needs and so forth, it was going to be just the 11th Airborne Division alone. So instead of 3, it's now dropped to 1, facing intense odds. So it's not surprising that General MacArthur's headquarters almost issued orders canceling 8th Army's landings at Nasugbu. That was until General Robert Eichelberger intervened at General Swing's insistence. Now, Swing and Eichelberger both said that they knew at the time that intelligence reports that came from Filipino guerrillas were sometimes exaggerated and incorrect. And so they decided that they were willing to take that gamble of landing, but with a compromise. Instead of landing the division's 187th Paraglider Infantry Regiment at Lucena, and then landing the 188th Glider Infantry Regiment at Nasugbu, they decided that they would cancel the Lucena landings and then land both regiments at Nasugbu. The amphibious landing force would then push inland, but if it ran into too much resistance, the Angels would withdraw back to the beaches at Nasugbu and then make their ways back to the ships offshore. And if that happened, the 511th PIR's drops on Tagaytay Ridge would be canceled. So General MacArthur's headquarters agreed with this compromise. So on January 26th, the Angels who were going to sail to Nasugbu practiced some amphibious landings on Leyte's Beetle Beach from assault craft. And then the next day, January 27th, 1945, the Angels who were headed for Nasugbu, they boarded 4 APDs, or fast destroyer escorts, 32 LCIs, landing craft infantry, 8 LSMs, landing ship mediums, and 6 LSTs, which is landing ship tank. So kind of an interesting thing I found when I was researching this assault for our 3 books on the Angels in World War II. I found that the Angels didn't actually know what ships were coming until they arrived on January 25th. So the loading of supplies took about 24 hours, and then, everybody got underway. Sergeant Edward Hemrich of the 188th Glider Infantry, he said, "The 4 days aboard were spent cleaning our weapons because by now we were known as the mud hogs of Leyte, and body and equipment had to be revived." Now, the Angels transports were part of the 120-ship Navy Task Force Group 78.2 under Rear Admiral William Fetchler, and since their LCIs lacked cooking facilities, a bunch of the Angels actually complained. They said, "Hey, we didn't get our traditional steak and eggs last meal before we hit the beaches." But on January 31st, which was X Day, at 7 o'clock in the morning, things kicked off, and the Angels on deck watched 18 A-20 Havocs and 9 P-38s fly over, and they just raked the landing beaches. And those beaches are beautiful, by the way. Nasugbu today, just like before the war, is a sought-after tourist destination. But on January 31st, 1945, the U.S. Navy bombarded Red Beach. Captain Leo Crawford, who was in command of the 188th Company C, he was watching the Navy blast the beaches, and he said, he turned to Major David Walker, who was in the same boat as he was, and he said, "We're going to have to find another beach because the Navy is obliterating this one." And no one was really complaining because the Angels and the Navy both knew that the Japanese had the landing beaches zeroed with 2 75mm gun batteries and several machine guns, all of which were emplaced, at Wawa and on the high grounds at Nasugbu Point and San Diego Point. So some of the Navy's firing was actually in the direction of those known enemy emplacements, while the rest was simply to soften up the landing beaches. So the Angels of the 188th 1st Battalion moved ashore at A-15, and they did so in, 4 columns of LCVPs, which, long name is Landing Craft Vehicle Personnel, which are more commonly known as Higgins boats. And you've probably seen those on Saving Private Ryan or any footage of the D-Day landings at Normandy. Now, the 188th 2nd Battalion would follow in the larger LCMs at about 8:30, and I do want to point out that both the 187th and the 188th only had 2 battalions, not 3. So these 2 regiments that are about to hit the beaches, they're about half the size of a standard infantry regiment in World War II. And this is a map overlay of the Red Beach landing zones with Nasugbu behind it. You can see the 188th's phase lines, but the Angels ended up moving faster than the estimated times it would take for their objectives. Now, everyone carried 1K and 2D rations and 1 unit of fire for the assault. And one of the Angels joked, We did not see our personal baggage until 2 months after the landing. But the 188th Captain Leo Crawford, he said, we made a run for the beach, the front end dropped down, and we jumped off into 4 or 5 feet of water, which you can see some actual footage of here that I dug out of the archives. It is a little grainy, but you have to remember it's early in the morning, and this footage is being shot during the assault in 1945. Now, jumping off in the 5 feet of water wasn't really that big of a deal for anyone who was over 5 feet tall, but Leo's radio man, Fred Cole, he was about 5'4", so he stepped into the water, and Leo said he just disappeared. So, the radio man joked that he preferred to be next to the 6'4" Captain Crawford because Leo offered a bigger target for Japanese snipers. But Leo got the last laugh after the situation was deemed to be non-life-threatening. He said, in late afternoon, Fred and I were standing together, and a sniper shot him through the knee, a nice clean hole with hardly any blood. Evidently, the sniper picked him because he had the radio. And although he was wounded, Fred Cole stayed by Leo's side throughout the rest of their time in Nasugbu. And while Leo put the tough radio operator in for Bronze Star, Leo said, quote, some jerk at regimental headquarters wanted to know what Fred had done to deserve it, and as far as I know, he never got it. Now, over in their own Higgins boat, Sergeant Edward Hamrich of the 188th Headquarters Company, he said, I don't think we were in our ship headed for shore for 5 minutes when Mike Levicus, my clerk, let me know in a whisper, Ed, do you know today is my birthday? I did not say anything to Mike then, but I did offer up a silent prayer. Lord, please let Mike have his next birthday, and if not, see that I am not around if you deem otherwise. And I do want to point out there was some light resistance to the Angels' landings in the form of some artillery fire and machine gun fire. Shortly after moving off the beach, Sergeant Hamrich said he came upon a sight which he never forgot. He said, there by the side of the road, lying side by side, were 2 men, which I only saw alive and well a half hour before. I think I changed from a boy to a man at that moment. And the Nasugbu landings were made by really boys. Most of the Angels were 18 or 19 years of age, as you can see in this footage here of a gun crew of the division's 475th Glider Field Artillery, which had just hit the beaches at Nasugbu. Now, the 188th 1st Battalion's landings were being led by Lieutenant Colonel Ernest Laflame, who was acting as the regiment's guide. Colonel Laflame was one of those Angels who had served in the area before the war. He actually told his men, my wife and I used to come to these beaches to relax. But 7 minutes after hitting the beach, Colonel Laflame sent a radio message back saying that the landings were mostly unopposed. So since the 188th Artillery had yet to land due to some difficulties, which we'll talk about in a second, Colonel Laflame sent Company C, which was again under Captain Leo Crawford. He sent Company C north towards Nasugbu Point to take out the enemy's 75mm gun that was there, that the Japanese could actually pull back into a cave after firing. So the Navy's firing on the gun was proving ineffective. And Captain Crawford said, we had been in continuous action since before dawn with little rest the previous night. Everyone was exhausted. The company had about 10 casualties out of 130 that went ashore that morning. The next morning, we jumped off in the attack again and very easily cleaned out Nasugbu Point. Now, Leo's company did have some help in their assault. So naval fire was carefully called in, and it hit about 300 yards from C Company's positions. And the Angels quickly moved in and eliminated the last Japanese on the point, which sits north of the town of Nasugbu. So C Company is sent north to Nasugbu Point to take care of the gun there, and then after the 188th 2nd Battalion lands, E Company is sent south to take care of the gun and machine gun positions on San Diego Point. And E Company said they had to use flamethrowers and demolition kits to achieve their objectives. So, fun fact, the Angels used flamethrowers over 200 times in their operations around Laguna de Bay. Mostly they were using the M2 model and, the things you find when you're digging into the archives for research. But I really put that tidbit in there for all of you living historians out there who are reenacting and portraying the 11th Airborne Division at events. So, thank you for putting in that work. I know you appreciate the tiny details. But the rest of the 188th 2nd Battalion moved to secure Lyon and then eliminate the Japanese forces there. And so they were really protecting the division's right flank. And while all this is going on, Lieutenant Colonel Laflamme is moving the rest of the 188th into Nasugbu itself, which proved to be kind of a trick. This photo was taken a few years before the War of the Landing Beaches, but you can see getting everyone off the beaches took some time since there were really only two roads leading inland through the swamps, flooded rice paddies, and the coastal streams that separated Nasugbu from the beaches. And these hills in the distance, that's San Diego Point to the south, which Easy Company was fighting to clear. Now, this map shows what I'm talking about a bit better. You can see the landing beaches here and the two roads leading inland here and here. But a lot of this area was marshy, which made moving men and equipment a challenge. But by 9:45 on X-ray Day, January 31st, 1945, the Angels made it into town and secured Nasugbu's small airstrip, which you can see a photo of here. So here's the town, and here's the airstrip. And here's a closer photo of the airstrip itself. A few days after securing the town, the Angels would watch C-47s land on this strip, carrying badly needed ammunition, food, fuel, and other supplies. And this photo was taken in 1945 after the 11th Airborne Division had moved inland for the Battle of Manila and then eventually dropping on Apari and so forth. But if you look closely, you can see 3 C-47s parked on the Nasugbu airstrip waiting for the next mission. But as the 188th troopers marched into Nasugbu itself, they were met by jubilant Filipinos and European refugees, actually. Filipinos are shouting, "Victory, mabuhay, thank God." They're just so excited to see the Americans landing. And this is footage of some Spanish refugees that were living in Nasugbu who are sharing intel with this angel. And the refugees even offered the Angels some Spanish wine, which was gratefully received, but all this celebrating actually brought out a concern. Remember those two Angels who were sent to Nasugbu to recon and gather intelligence from the Filipino guerrillas? Well, when the Angels started pushing into town, the locals said, "The 11th Airborne is finally here. What took you so long?" Right? They knew by name that the 11th Airborne Division was coming. So luckily the Japanese did not, and the Angels were able to pull off that surprise. And on the topic of luck, the Angels were lucky that the Japanese had not finished their defenses in Nasugbu and the surrounding area, or else those landings could have been a lot hotter. So after consulting with the battalion commanders who were on shore, General Robert Eichelberger decided that the landings were indeed light, and he decided to send in the 187th Paraglider Infantry Regiment, which really had been held in Floating Division Reserve. And, I say Paraglider Infantry Regiment because a good portion of the 187th had gone through the division's jump school on New Guinea and were jump qualified. So General Swing started calling the 187th a paraglider unit. So the 187th 1st Battalion landed at about 10:30 that morning, and they quickly moved to assemble in the Don Pedro Sugar Central area, which, by the way, I found out, again digging in the archives, the random things you find, the Don Pedro Sugar Central area could produce 2,600 metric tons of sugar a day. Now, Assistant Division Commander Brigadier General Albert Pearson, again, Big Al, he was in this wave with the 187th. So, as he's walking down the ramp of his LCM, an enemy machine gun bullet comes in, hits close enough to rip the belt buckle off that he's wearing, and it destroys his compass. And it was probably fired from Wawa, And this was about the time the Japanese actually started firing on the landing craft from Wawa. So General Pearson looks down at his torn belt, considers how close things had been, and he says to those around him, "Well, it left my navel intact." PFC Roger Zerfus, who was the one in the 188th E Company, he said of Pearson, "He is a general and a first-class gentleman of the highest order." And again, everybody called him Big Al because of his size, but also because of his big heart. And as for the enemy machine gunner that was firing on them from Wawa, well, the Angels figured out where that gun crew was, and they sent word to the naval gunners offshore, who promptly obliterated the building, and the firing stopped. Now, the 187th 2nd Battalion landed a little bit later that afternoon, and First Lieutenant Eli Bernheim said of their landings, "We got off the LCI ramps into waist-deep water, and our boots got full of sand, which must be a real problem for troops who make a beach assault and have to drive inland without having time to get the sand out of their boots." And so Lieutenant Bernheim was pointing out a problem that had been causing some headaches all morning. So let's dive into that. The morning was so calm that the ocean was pretty flat. And while the Angels' initial waves were made up of Angels riding in those Higgins boats, smaller craft, less draft, as the morning progressed, the next waves were made up of heavier transports with deeper drafts, right? So the tide continued to go out, and the waters got shallower and shallower, and even some of their lighter landing craft were getting stuck offshore. So the larger supply and equipment ships, plus their waterproof vehicles, were all stuck far from the beaches. So this is kind of cool. Since a rising tide lifts all boats, at 10:20, permission was given for the Navy's larger escorts to cruise down the beach so that their wakes would lift and push the Angels' transports closer to shore where they could let down their ramps for unloading. Now, another solution that was quickly put into practice once the problem was, discovered, was the use of ducks, which had been placed on board some of the ships in the Navy's task force. However, that solution wasn't as easy as it initially sounds. You see, the 11th Airborne Division did not have specific drivers for these ducks. So, since their trucks were stuck in the ships, they could not make it to shore yet. The Angels took their truck drivers and gave them very, very, very fast instructions on driving ducks. And so their truck drivers were used to shuttle troops and equipment to shore in these ducks. And by now, the beach landing party had marked safe landing sites, so all these solutions I'm telling you about were all beneficial, but the Angels were finding that instead of the wide beach to land in, they had narrow channels, and so things were starting to back up a little bit. For example, one after action report notes, because of unsatisfactory beaching conditions, only 3/8 of the wire equipment and 1/2 of the radio equipment of the 511th Airborne Signal Company were unloaded. So again, things are backing up. Things aren't getting unloaded as quickly as they had planned on. But at least the opposition was light. But once the equipment did get to shore, Colonel Jose Rason, a Filipino officer, organized the grateful men of Nasugbu into shore parties to help the Angels bring their supplies ashore. So this is a photo of the colonel's guerrillas gathered here in Nasugbu's town square, and it was taken on the day the Angels landed, January 31st, 1945. And I believe these Filipino guerrillas were mostly from Terry's Hunters, but I'm still digging into that. Now, Colonel Rason had graduated from the U.S. Military Academy before serving on General MacArthur's staff in the Philippines, and now he was coordinating guerrilla forces in the area. And of note, General Swing, after they pushed out of Nasugbu, he took control of all Filipino guerrilla units in southern Luzon. So, kind of a cool part of the 11th Airborne Division's history. Now, the guerrillas from Nasugbu would go on to help the Angels in their push inland towards Tagaytay Ridge and then Manila. I found a transcript of an interview with a Japanese officer who was captured later in the campaign, and he said this was Captain Nikichi Yagashi, and he was with Japan's 31st Infantry Regiment. And he said, being familiar with the terrain, The guerrillas served as guides and during our withdrawal obtained information concerning our movements. This information enabled the Americans to bombard our personnel while on the move. And I also want to give credit to the Filipino women of the area who, especially those who were trained as nurses, who volunteered to serve in the division's hospital, which was set up in the Nasugbu town square. The skill and compassion of these Filipino women helped a lot of angels recover from their wounds. And often overlooked in the story of the 11th Airborne Division's landing at Nasugbu is Battery D of the 457th Parachute Field Artillery Battery. Now, Battery D was an interesting unit. It was not a traditional artillery battery as you might think of it. Battery D was actually armed with 50 caliber M45 quad mount anti-aircraft guns, not the 75 millimeter pack howitzers that the rest of the 457th had. But since their vehicle transports were having a hard time getting to shore, Battery D hand-towed their guns up the beach, and then they began firing on the enemy machine guns at Wawa. And then these angels hand-towed their guns into Nasugbu and set up around that small airstrip that we talked about. Not as anti-air defense, but no, they leveled their guns to be anti-personnel in case any Japanese decided to attack the division's liaison craft, which were being brought to shore. So the division's L4s were actually soon assembled by the 457th Air Section at this strip, and it was all under fire, mind you. So Battery D deserves some credit here. And some of Battery D's men also participated in patrols to the north and east of Nasugbu to eliminate Japanese holdouts. And then it gets even crazier. Battery D moved out with the frontline angels, hand-towing their guns nearly 20 miles in 24 hours to support the infantry on their way towards Tagaytay Ridge. So definitely a group of angels whose story deserves to be recognized. Okay, so let's review. By now, the Angels had captured Nasugbu and Wawa by 10:15. They had taken over Nasugbu's airstrip and converted it into a larger strip overnight using Jeep headlights for illumination. And then the Angels were beginning to set up a supply depot and ammunition dump in town with the help of locals, and then also their hospital in the town square. So all this was done by an airborne division full of troopers who were still worn out from the Leyte Campaign. In fact, many in the 11th Airborne Division had been told by the medics and surgeons that they needed to spend more time recuperating before they participated in combat operations, and this was due to jaundice or other tropical illnesses. But these angels chose instead to land and fight with their buddies at Nasugbu, and you can see why the 11th Airborne Division had gained the nickname the Fighting Angels. Now, back on board his ship, the Spencer, 8th Army's General Robert Eichelberger stood on the bridge as another ship arrived to offer the landings additional protection, right? So Eichelberger is listening to the captain of this ship radio in, and the captain radios, "Like the June bride, I am ready and willing." So this is an actual photo of General Eichelberger on the left on board the Spencer, and he's talking to Admiral Frank Fletcher on the right. So in the middle is Colonel Frank Bowen, who was General Eichelberger's G3. And Bowen's relationship with the 11th Airborne Division would continue after World War II, especially into the Korean War, where then General Frank Bowen commanded the 187th Regimental Combat Team, the Rakkasans, through the war. But listening to the progress reports of the landings, General Eichelberger made the decision to land the rest of the 11th Airborne. The Angels' reconnaissance in force was now going to continue its full-blown press inland. So we have to remember the compromise was if the 11th Airborne Division landed, pushed inland, and hit too much resistance, they would just withdraw back to the beaches and then back to the ships. And this was still a possibility. When the 188th GIR first encountered Filipino guerrillas about 11 o'clock, the Filipinos kept saying that the situation inland was awful and that the terrain was full of Japanese and defensive fortifications. So, even so, General Eichelberger gave the order to push forward. So, upon receiving Eichelberger's radio message at his CP, which was a schoolhouse on Nasugbu's town square. General Joseph Swing sent the 188th GIR's 1st Battalion up Highway 17 towards Tagaytay Ridge, which, again, that is where the 511th RCT was going to jump on. So 2nd Battalion would soon join them after the 187th took over their positions. But you can actually see this is the 188th Troopers marching through Nasugbu's town square on January 31st, 1945. So the 188th GIR's order of march was A Company, Headquarters Company, B Company, and then C Company. And these Angels pressed forward through the Don Pedro Sugar Central with the objective of moving fast to keep the enemy on the run before the Japanese could organize their defensive lines further inland. So somewhere on the march, I thought this was pretty cool. Somewhere on the march through all the sugarcane fields, they encountered the wreckage of this shot down Japanese plane. So the 188th 1st Battalion quickly marched to the Steel Trust Palico River Bridge, and in a hair-raising race, they fired at 2:30. They fired on the Japanese on the other side, and the Japanese were trying to reach the detonators to blow the bridge across the 250-foot gorge, which would have been a big problem because the Angels engineers did not have material to span that big of a gorge, and so the division's push inland would have been stalled. The only other crossing was several miles away, which would meant a major delay. So after effectively eliminating the Japanese guards on the other side of the bridge, Colonel Laflamme's men crossed the bridge at 15:30, and by 1600, the 11th Airborne's attack was several phase lines ahead of schedule. Remember this map that we looked at earlier, you can see the phase lines with the times that they were estimating they would achieve them on. The 127th Airborne Engineers then followed 1st Battalion and began removing all the demo charges that the Japanese had placed on the bridge. Now, pausing to rest at about 1800, the Angels of the 188th quietly discussed where the Japanese may be hiding near Aga as they ate their K-ration dinners. The 188th had pushed inland for 8 miles. And again, these were veterans of the Leyte Campaign. So they assumed correctly that the enemy was pulling back to more well-prepared defensive positions, which were going to cost more lives to take in the next few days. But the Japanese knew they did not have enough men to cover all the potential landing beaches. So as General Swing set up his new CP right in the Palico barracks by the Palico River Bridge, the enemy was consolidating its strength around the Aga Pass, which was a narrow defile that Swing's Angels could actually see in the distance, and they knew that's where they were going because Tagaytay Ridge was just beyond that. And it's interesting, Japanese soldiers who were later captured in the Aga area, they said they had watched the 11th Airborne Division's landings on the beaches and then watched the Angels push into Nasugbu, and then they watched the Angels moving to the bridge and then beyond. And here's the thing is communications were down in the area. So the Japanese in Nasugbu could not communicate with the Japanese in the Aga Pass, and the Japanese in the Aga Pass could not communicate with those closer to Tagaytay Ridge. So that worked in the Angels' favor. But the Japanese who were captured later on said it was interesting because they knew as they watched the Angels marching inland that they were coming their way. We have to remember that moving inland was still a risk. If the Angels ran into an overwhelming force, they could withdraw to the beaches and then get back to the Navy ships. But if they were encircled by the overwhelming forces, the 11th Airborne could potentially be destroyed before such a withdrawal could be effected. So this was a high-risk, high-reward scenario, and General Eichelberger and General Swing went all in. And man, our next video on the battle for the Aga Pass is going to be incredible, but you're going to have to wait till next time. But before we go, I do want to point out that the 11th Airborne Division established their first cemetery on Luzon at Nasugbu, which you can see in photos here. This was officially known as USAF Cemeteries Batangas No. 1. But beneath these simple markers lie troopers who answered the call to serve, who carried not just rifles, but the fragile hope of freedom for a distant people they had never met. Here we see the cost of freedom, and the price the angels paid in their fight against Imperial Japan to liberate the people of Luzon. Many of these fallen angels and their first cavalry comrades were later moved to the beautiful Manila American Cemetery, and they lie there in rest on the grounds that once echoed with the chaos of battle. The story of the Nasugbu landings, the 11th Airborne Division's battle to liberate Luzon, it's a story of courage demonstrated by young men who knew what the cost might be, but who pressed forward anyway. Each grave, first at Nasugbu and then in Manila, is a quiet testament to sacrifice, lives given so that others might live unafraid. And though far from the towns and families they left behind, the legacy of these angels endures in the freedom of Luzon's people, written not in words, but in the silence of these sacred grounds, and the millions of Filipinos who now live in freedom and peace. I hope you enjoyed learning about the 11th Airborne Division's amphibious landings at Nasugbu in 1945. You can learn more about the 11th Airborne Division's Luzon campaign in our books, When Angels Fall, the 511th PIR in World War II, which is often called the Band of Brothers of the Pacific, and our 2-volume series, Down from Heaven, the 11th Airborne Division in World War II. Volume 3 will cover the Korean War, and I'm currently working on that, so stay tuned. Our books are available wherever history publications are sold, especially Amazon, although if you'd like signed copies, you can get those through our online store, 11thairbornestore.com. We have quite a few airborne-related gifts and items in the store, so be sure to check it out, including our new commemorative 11th Airborne Heritage t-shirts and coffee mugs, and also challenge coins and patches and stickers. You name it, we've got it. And if we don't have it, let us know. We'll see what we can do. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and subscribe to this channel and then share it with his friend. We have a lot more 11th Airborne Division history to share, but until then, thanks for joining us today. We'll see you in the next episode. Down from heaven comes 11, airborne all the way.